if we don't start really tackling these problems in a very serious way within the next, as I say, 15 months, that next generation of people, they're going to be subject to things that we couldn't even imagine. The truth is, when we say AI is like the word Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi was, it originally came up as a particular 802.11 protocol. And then people said, let's put a fancy name to this. It's the same kind of thing. It's like, let's layer a kind of easy to digest concept over something that's pretty complex. It is a tool, but fire is a tool. But fire, unless handled properly, can be catastrophic. But ultimately, AI or large language models are really ought to be tuned to serve humanity first. And that really means serving the individual first. Privacy has to sit at the very center, and there's a lot of lip service around it. But the truth is, none of the big companies at this point, none of the big large language model and hyperscalers are really addressing privacy in any way that's truly relevant in the environment that we're dealing with.
Today's episode is brought to you by Chords, makers of award-winning professional-grade connectivity solutions designed by integrators for integrators. If you're listening to this podcast, you already know that reliability is crucial. That's why professionals around the world choose Chords. Born in Australia and trusted in over 50 countries, Chords provides robust, fast and effective HDMI, audio, networking, USB-C and control cabling engineered for residential, commercial and mission-critical applications. With over 20 years of experience and a promise of connectivity assured, every Chords product is tested, certified and backed by expert support. Level up your installs today by visiting chords.com.au. That's KORDZ.com.au.
Hello and welcome to Master Integrator, the podcast that explores how smart home technology shapes the way we live, connect and make decisions. I'm your host, Paul Skelton. We've all seen the promises. AI that anticipates our needs, learns our behaviours and helps create seamless experiences. But what happens when that intelligence starts to cross boundaries? Collecting data, making decisions and nudging behaviour in ways that we don't fully understand. My guest today is Andrew Sispoidis, founder of Kynismos AI, a company that's building artificial intelligence systems with privacy and human rights at the core. His mission is clear: to create technology that's built for people, not platforms. Andrew's background spans AI, policy and activism, and he brings a refreshingly candid take on where things are going and how we might want to slow down before handing over the reins. In this episode, we talk about what it means to build ethical AI, how ambient intelligence and surveillance differ, why most systems are designed for control, not consent, and what integrators can do today to prioritise privacy in their projects. If you've ever felt uneasy about where AI is headed, or wondered what role you play in shaping it, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. But first, a huge thank you to our sponsors, Chords and Connected Magazine, for making these conversations possible. This is Master Integrator. Here's Andrew Sispoidis. So for those of you who are listening who might not be familiar with you and your company, can you give us a little bit of a background of how you got started and how your company, Kynismos, started as well?
Absolutely, Paul. First of all, thank you for having me on. And the company started, the origin of it was really, I've been in 30 years plus in technology. Started off in gaming, from there got into more serious technologies and and that got involved in the cybersecurity space about 15 years ago. And kind of saw behind the curtain in terms of all the variety of threat vectors that existed in the world and how those are becoming magnified with each layer of new technology, social media being one that basically kind of opened the door, opened the gate. Now, AI, large language models, machine learning, computer vision, all those start to add additional layers of complexity to the threat environment when it comes to everything from individuals, families, professionals, institutions, enterprises. The threat environment has become extremely sophisticated, and I kind of seen it evolve over those years. And so what it led me to is, I think we have one opportunity right now, and I think that opportunity is probably over the next 15 months to really kind of create a security environment, something that allows for privacy to be at the very center of any interaction with any artificial intelligence. So the human-machine interaction across any spectrum really ought to have a privacy layer as a central part of it. And so that's what we set out to build. We have the first version that's out now. It's a kind of just post beta, I guess, it's an early version of it, very functional. It's supposed to do extremely well with no bells and whistles, but it is an extremely capable platform. So you can interact with any large language model in a completely private way at this point.
Okay. So you've described Kynismos as AI built for humans, not platforms, before. So what does that actually mean in practice?
So in practice, the idea is to create as simple and as familiar environment as possible. So what's going to happen over the next several years is, and actually OpenAI just made a great announcement. They're doing their voice interface is kind of now completely interactive. So using over telephony or directly to device. The idea that the human element, meaning the interaction individuals are going to be having with machines, is going to become more integrated into the fabric of our daily life. That basically means it's skewing more towards human language versus kind of technical knowledge. And the technical knowledge will be offloaded primarily to machines, effectively. So the idea there is, we really wanted to head that off as early as we possibly can, make an easy as possible user experience, a familiar as possible user experience, and then basically layer the security in as transparent a way as possible. And by transparent, I mean both visible in terms of how the security works, but also on the other side, as invisible to the user as possible, so that they can just interact, know that what they're doing is completely and totally private, and they're secure. And that's the idea behind that.
So there's probably two concepts that I want to talk to you about. One of them is obviously AI, to kind of really define what we're talking about, but also then privacy. So I've just come back from a trade show for the AV and technology industry. Now, every second stand you walk past, people are saying, this is powered by AI. It has AI. It's almost become diluted to the point where it's almost the new green or smart. It feels like everyone's pushing it, but there's no real clarity about what they're actually talking about. So I feel like that's what leads to a lot of the confusion in the market. So from your perspective, what is AI, but what are those biggest misconceptions out there in the market that people are kind of running with, that you kind of see there, look at and go, well, that's just not a thing, or that's really the wrong conversation?
That's a really great concept to be wrestling with at this point. The truth is, when we say AI is like the word Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi was, it originally came up as a particular 802.11 protocol. That was and then people said, let's put a fancy name to this, or a hi-fi for that matter, back in the days. It's the same kind of thing. It's like, let's layer a kind of easy to digest concept over something that's pretty complex. But ultimately, when we say AI now, the kind of the most popular version of artificial intelligence, and I think I'm kind of speaking to the choir here. I think you know all this already, but I'll kind of cover just on a very low level. We're really saying large language models. So when people are interacting with artificial intelligence today, kind of in air quotes, we're saying they're interacting with large language models. Primarily, that's a front-facing layer of that. So, but OpenAI is, that's one example. Anthropic's another example. Meta or Google or Grok, any of those platforms are basically large language models with a front end that is a voice interface, a textual interface, a visual interface. And when we start to move into the visual interface, then we start adding other types of machine learning or artificial intelligence in a broader sense, and we're looking at computer vision as an aspect of that. And then we look at even further machine learning, kind of deep machine learning that can basically synthesize complex data and make sense of it. That's not language based or text based. So when we say AI, it's a very broad concept, and it's a thing that will constantly evolve over the years. But when we talk about it today, what people are really generally saying is large language models and interaction with those large language models.
So I guess one of the things that I hear out there from the advocates of AI and using LLMs is that AI is neutral. It's just a tool. There's no real risk around it. From your perspective, do you agree with that? If not, why not? And is there something inherently biased in how AI is being developed and deployed today?
Well, that's a really great point. And the argument I would make, without being too alarmist about it, and I think there's a level of neutrality there. There is absolutely that. It is a tool, but fire is a tool. But fire, unless handled properly, can be catastrophic. So there is truth in the fact that it is a tool, and it's a very powerful tool that can have multiple applications. At the same time, what's really important is to understand that we have a relationship with that tool, like any tool, and we need to use it in a way that's actually going to be both effective and also serve the needs of the user and serve the needs of the broader community and the world in general, serve humanity, really. I mean, we're building it with humanity in mind. And then possibly, I guess I would argue that, serve humanity, serve the environment. I mean, there's ways to look at this to say it can have broader applications, but ultimately AI or large language models ought to be tuned to serve humanity first. And that really means serving the individual first at the very core level. I think that's the first place to attack this.
Is that happening, in your opinion?
Woefully little. unfortunately. And I think that we are among the few, and I don't, I'm not setting ourselves apart. I think there are a lot of incredible thinkers out there, really brilliant people doing great work. I think that the drivers, meaning the amount of capital flowing into large language models and AI in general, it's mind-numbing, just the amount of capital flowing in, which creates these kind of perverse incentives in some sense. So the idea is people chasing those goals, and in order to maintain some level of leadership in that area, they're foregoing some of their fundamentals because it just don't have the time to focus on those things. So it really does fall. I think the answer is no, it's not happening enough, but it does fall on smaller companies like us and smaller teams like us to actually start to look at those problems, pick up those threads, and really kind of start stitching things together before things unravel.
Yeah, so you mentioned there, obviously not wanting to be an alarmist, but I think there's this mindset out there in the industry that anyone who raises issues with AI, you're basically saying the sky is falling. So how do we get around that argument and, I guess, accept the fact that, yes, there are issues here. We need to talk about them. We're not saying don't use it. We're not saying don't use AI, don't implement AI, but there's key issues here that need to be addressed. How do we go about it, addressing those in a way that is going to be listened to and acknowledged?
That's another really good question. And I think that part of it is there's a lot of regulation, a lot of regulatory activity happening now around AI. I think much of it is misguided and much of it is short-sighted. And I think that not because there are not brilliant people working on that, there are, and with great intentions. At the same time, it's really hard to anticipate where that ball is going to be. So you either cast a very, very wide net, and by doing so, you may squash not only innovation, but also some of the real solutions that could actually solve the problems that you're looking to solve through regulation. So it's complicated in that way. So I think it's a multilateral approach. I think that certainly having the visibility of regulators is important, of politics, of public scrutiny, that's really important. I think on the other side of it, I think the best way to solve these problems, the best way to attack this, to kind of approach it, is really through the kinds of things that, I'd say entrepreneurship and looking at industry to solve its own problems, but really incentivizing it. I think the big challenge is, and I can't talk details about this, but we're in the process of raising capital as part of what we're doing. In doing that, the challenge is you're going out and saying, we're going to go after behemoths. We're going to go after, it's David and Goliath to some degree, because what we're doing is a little bit contrary to the information gathering and taking of, all the nuance that goes around human interaction, capturing it in some sense and trying to create utility out of it. We're saying, yes, we can do some of that, but what's really important is to first solve the human sovereignty issue, the individual sovereignty issue, and also the data security issue and the privacy issues. Those three things first. And then, yes, let's find ways to then, create nuance and meaning from that data in a way that is functional and kind of helps things scale. So I think it's a little bit of a reverse approach. And I think that the incentives are challenging at the moment. So the solution is A, regulation, B, the kind attention put to these very core issues that really need to be solved today, and not relying on the big 5 or 6 to really solve those problems. I think that's a really important thing. We can't, it's contrary, I guess I would say. The final thing I'd say around that is it is contrary. What we're doing is contradictory to the state of the art right now. And that means that privacy has to sit at the very center, and there's a lot of lip service around it. And it's really well-crafted lip service, and it really sounds compelling. But the truth is, none of the big companies at this point, none of the big large language model and hyperscalers are really addressing privacy in any way that's truly relevant in the environment that we're dealing with.
So let's talk a little bit about privacy, because that is obviously one of the core pillars of Kynismos. I've just had a conversation with someone from Amazon about the rise of ambient sensing and the role it's going to be playing within control in homes. We talk about facial recognition and other biometrics. I've also spoken about, obviously, voice assistants. They're always on. When we talk about privacy, is true privacy actually even possible today? Or is that something that's kind of a lofty goal that realistically we're never really going to get to?
I love that you're looking at that question, because that's something that's really close to my heart, and something that we have a roadmap to address a lot of those issues. Some of the time that I spent over the past 15 years has been kind of national security space, to understand cybersecurity on a really deep level and to understand, again, those threat vectors. And sensors are, and one of the things I would do these high level briefings, and one of the concepts there was kind of multi-dimensional sensors, essentially, everything from phased array antennas to extremely sensitive, basically every sensor you can imagine will be enhanced to such a degree where, yes, the ambient computing was a concept at one point, probably about 20 years ago, and now it's actually kind of reaching fruition and becoming a reality. So why I say it's close to my heart is because the roadmap for Kynismos, the desire there is to say we're going to start with text and voice. We're going to start with large language models. We're extending it to computer vision. We want to obfuscate, basically redact anything that, and still retain relevance, redact anything that a user does with any large language model, be the intermediary there, keep zero information of any kind in those interactions, basically strip out the who from the what, from the context completely. Whether it's a face recognition, there's no reason why that couldn't be a proxy face. There's no reason why that couldn't be a tokenized face, not an actual human being that the camera is seeing. And again, this will take some cooperation from the industry, but I think that it is possible. I think it will take cooperation from the industry. And I think that's an area where regulation might be able to play a really good role. Some mandates that kind of say, look, these are important things to allow for, and, allow those hooks basically, or make them mandatory to some degree.
So one of the first episodes that we recorded of this show was with a woman named Shannon Marsh, and her whole specialty is ethical technology design. And it was a fascinating conversation. I don't think I actually spoke for about 45 minutes of that. I just let her go because it was fascinating, but also a little terrifying. But one of the concepts that she spoke about was value tension. And that is, these days, obviously, people want to be secured in their home, but that would imply that you have to have security cameras everywhere. So that means you can't really have privacy because you can have cameras facing areas where you might be, and you're always going to be on film. So how would that apply to what we're talking about here in terms of privacy? I mean, are there things that as a society we're going to have to trade off in order to have that privacy? And in your mind, if so, what would that likely be?
That's, again, another really good question. So I think one way to look at it, from my perspective, one way to look at it is say that maybe there's 3 points of tension in that. One is the individual and or the institution. In this case, I'm kind of grouping an institution with individuals, like, whether it's an institution, whether it's a family, whether it's a small group, working group, company. I'm looking at that as the user, let's say, the object essentially of that is privacy and security. Then the other side of it is the governmental, law enforcement, those type of, that tension, that pole that pulls in that direction. And then the other is the utility, the value that it brings, and then the monetization of that utility. If we see those 3 things, there's always going to be some tension there. And so my answer is, yes, I believe we can have true privacy, even in a very information-rich environment, if we allow for the processing of, if we can compartmentalize the information in such a way that we can give some utility to law enforcement. I think that's necessary. I think that, because there's a lot of things that can happen there that you'd want to have that. But at the same time, we can complete that so compartmentalized and strip away so much of that data that law enforcement would require a high bar in order to be able to not access that data, because that wouldn't exist. Like right now, the way we're doing it, it doesn't even exist. So it would basically be, okay, look, there's a subpoena, there's a legal request for particular information. And then, in the US, you'd have to get a judge to basically say, okay, we're allowing for a warrant. That a warrant allow for the police to, to start to do an investigation. But they'd have to use old world methods. It wouldn't be just plug and play and just have it work. So the idea would be that, yes, you can have an environment where there is complete privacy and security, even in an information-rich environment like the one we're describing, where there's cameras everywhere, that has to be processed. And I can describe the architecture generally, but if that data is processed locally and the hardware is there, the GPUs will be there, all the technology will be there to do that, processed locally, stripped of all context, and then basically then shared to a network, I think that that's a really good way to actually do some of that. So in kind of a top level, that's how I would approach that. That's how we are approaching it. Strip away all that context on a local basis behind, multiple layers of encryption, and then allow for the relevant information to go out in an abstracted way, and then bring it back and synthesize it. That's the idea, kind of how we architected Kynismos, but also that applies across multiple applications. And in an environment like that, we can actually create an incredible balance where, the individual token, let's say, as far as the system is concerned, can be completely private and can be completely secure as well. That can be tracked within the system, and only relevant information would go out anywhere else, as an example.
Yeah. While I was doing some research for this episode, I came across the concept of surveillance capitalism and then context-aware assistance. Are you able to explain a little bit about what those are and then what that line is between those two?
Yeah, so context-aware assistants are essentially the kinds of things that we're describing. They're enabled today by being able to get the context. So, for example, trying to think without naming names, the idea is an assistant that resides within your environment. And it's attached to all of your account information. Let's say whether it's email and text messaging, phone, voice conversations, all that, all your accounts, all that, and have as much knowledge about you and your daily activities as possible. By having that knowledge, then it can take action for you. It knows that you're going to take a trip next week and you want to go to 3 different places. It already knows that. It can start basically working on that, finding the best prices, doing the arrangement without any real effort from the user, as an example. That would just happen in the background, and basically very much like a personal assistant. That's an example of that kind of utility. When it comes to surveillance capitalism, which is the opposite side of that, the way the industry is constructed today, the way that networks are constructed, it requires that information kind of go out into the network, into the world, operate across multiple vendors that have multiple layers that get in between the data and the utility. And those multiple vendors essentially capture a piece of it. It gets synthesized. Yes, it's abstracted, but it can easily be fingerprinted and kind of brought back together. And in some cases, it's not abstracted at all. So the idea there is that it's separate from the assistance, but that information gets extracted through that process. So it's an incredibly, that to me is one of the most dangerous areas that we're discussing really in general in this industry. Deep knowledge of the user's everything, effectively, sentiment, all the way down to the details of your transactions and everything else, all the way to going through multiple vendors, no real security in place, some privacy policy in place, but it's going out into a network. It's being, malicious actors, state actors that are in opposition to where you happen to live, as an example, all the way to just commercial interests, gather various parts of that information and they synthesize it. And then it affects your everything. It affects your, what we're seeing is even large language model conversations can affect insurance rates in the United States, as an example. They can affect a mortgage. They can affect, acceptance into a college. Social media certainly is already doing that. Getting a job, your social media feeds will get scanned. It's just a natural practice today. And that kind of creep always happens. So the answer is that those two things, the assistance and the surveillance capitalism, they're not in any way directly related, but they absolutely, surveillance capitalism certainly plays on that. It goes because it allows for, the assistance allows for a very deep understanding of the individual user. And then from there, the institution, and from there, all the needs and wants, desires, all that.
Connected Magazine is your go-to publication for the commercial and residential AV and smart home industry. The votes are in. The AV industry has spoken in the 2025 Most Popular Awards, with results across more than 40 categories. The awards section also profiles this year's most influential person, the former Golden Paul, if you will. Check out this and more in the latest edition of Connected, plus the website for all your AV news and new products. Links are in this episode's description.
So when we are talking about kind of having that deep understanding of people's private data, has the horse already bolted? I mean, how do we rein that back in? Is it possible? Because I can't see the bigger tech companies that already have access to this data through their LLMs being willing to give up that data. So I'm wondering, how do we undo what's already been done and then stop it from happening again?
Again, I love how you think about this stuff, because the answer is yes, there's mountains and mountains of data in the hands of big tech companies and therefore kind of in the world at this point. So the first thing to do is, I think, to stem the tide, is to basically, cut off put a tourniquet on, stop the bleeding, stop the hemorrhaging. I think that's an important part of this, is, to say that the system is still vital and it's still alive. Let's stop the hemorrhaging as quickly as we possibly can. There's a generation of people that are coming up that are going to be natives to this. And the idea is, can we protect those people in such a way that gives them a fair chance in the world? Because they really won't. They're going to end up in a world that's moving so fast, and they're going to be so steeped in it, and they're going to have an inability to truly understand all that complexity. So the idea is, can we stave that off now as quickly as we possibly? That's why I said earlier, I said, less than 2 years anyways. I give it that time horizon. If we don't start really tackling these problems in a very serious way within the next, I say 15 months, but, let's give it 2 years. If we don't tackle those today, that next generation of people, they're going to be subject to things that we couldn't even imagine, and a lot of negative consequences. And again, this is where it can get very dark, but I think we understand the super dark stuff. It's just the kind of all that space in between that seems anodyne, but it's really not. It's actually very sinister without any intention of it being sinister. I mean, at least, for the most part, certainly not commercial interests. So the answer is that we are at a time when we've ceded a lot of control. If we can stem that tide now, we can start holding some of that stuff back. We can actually start to recapture some sovereignty. Then once we understand what the dynamics of that, we can actually start to layer over regulation. I think that's an important area. Law and regulation can play a really important role there. As an example, regulation that gives sovereignty of data, and or regulation that allows for the selective monetization of data and the ability for the individual to recall data on a legal basis. I think it goes a ways. It doesn't solve the problem, but it certainly starts to heal the rift, basically.
I guess another challenge there is convenience. I mean, as a people, we love convenience, and the LLMs in particular, they're nothing if not convenient. And we do that as an industry as well on the smart home side. So what risks do you see in how these systems are being deployed currently from a residential integration perspective? Obviously, people are installing these systems into homes, maybe not necessarily to clients are fully aware of their capabilities, but what do you see as the big challenges there from the integration side?
So I think I have two ways to look at that from my perspective. One is that as Kynismos have given some thought to that, and we would like nothing more than to be able to partner with hardware companies and integrators as well, to be able to provide a layer of privacy into that world so that that the individual customer can have a selective layer of privacy layered over all the other security measures. And that's the kind of thing we'd love to tackle. So one side is a technical solution to that. I think we have one piece of that answer. And I think many other companies have kind of surrounding pieces to that. So part of it is, I think it is a technology issue. And I think we have the capabilities to solve some of those things to make it truly private. And the other side of it is also a technical side, which is but more systemic, which is to say, let's build standards that allow for local processing of all that data. There's no reason why we couldn't at this point. And in the near future, we can architect that today. And over the next couple of years, we can start integrating that. And then that would help a great deal, because then we actually have the local processing, a privacy layer that could allow for selective sharing of information, and then kind of AI layered over that's encapsulated and isolated as well. And then finally, and I can go into detail on this if you want, and then finally, the industry itself, I think my guess is the industry really does communicate very well with customers. And it really does share all the potential risks. It may not share all the potential complexities or the sophistication of the systems, but I think in general, my guess is the industry does a pretty good job, my experience, of actually sharing, like, this is a capability, and this is how we're going to configure it, and this is how it's going to work. So I think I would say with that, a little more education around that might be helpful as well.
Okay, so let's go a little bit more into the technical side there. Obviously, as an industry, smart home and commercial integration, commercial AV as well, we have our tried and tested systems, and they're the ones that they're deployed in the vast majority of jobs. However, as an industry, we also like to look at what's coming down the line and find those cutting edge systems. But by the time we look at them, they're not always fully realized. Mm-hmm. Are there systems on the market today, and this might be an opportunity to do a bit of a shameless promotion, but are there systems on the market today that are better at handling privacy than others? And not necessarily with naming them, but what are the questions that integrators and system designers should be asking now to make sure that what they're deploying is as safe as it could be?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that, broadly speaking, I would say that any system that it can actually control the data, meaning that not sharing that data with public sources or with basically large platforms that have processed that data, I think that so owning the data effectively would be an incredibly important part of a system that will actually be functional. So I'm not sure which companies truly own that data, because I think a lot of vendors are used in these complex systems. So that data is going to be leaked out and shared in some way. So owning the data, finding a way to actually own that data would be really important. I'm not sure of which companies do that very well, because it's a potentially costly thing to do. And I think it requires some scale to bring that cost down. So, but I'd say in general, that's one of the pieces. If a company can own that data and guarantee to their customers that, how exactly it's being, processed and retained, ideally, in my view, that happens locally as possible. And because all the sophistication of what we would traditionally do with a surveillance system or with a security system can now happen. Okay, I guess I would say it can't happen right away today, but over the next, again, 2 years, I think those systems will come into the world that will allow for that to happen on a local basis, and then allow for that privacy to be kind of layered over the top. It is a core area of where we want to work in the very near future. And we're just looking for the right partners to work with. We want to integrate. We have an API that we're building right now to basically just plug and play into any hardware device. So whether it's a camera or any security system, we'd be able to plug and play directly, provide that layer of privacy. And so any information that goes back and forth can basically be anonymized and kind of stripped of that context, but handled locally and then synthesized locally as well. So I'm not sure if the answer is the question or not.
It does. Are there key messages that you think integrators need to be giving to their end users and their clients? So obviously there's a very big kind of world of tricky situations when it comes to AI, but is there almost a checklist that as long as an integrator covers themselves on these key points, that they'll at least be covered, that they know that they've given their client the best opportunity to understand what's been installed and also to protect themselves?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think that because it is so intricate, it's almost, that checklist becomes multilateral. It kind of, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. So broadly, I think, so some of the new threats are AI, as an example. The ability for machine learning and computer vision and large language models to be able to take in, very complex environments, visual environments, and make inferences that are extremely accurate. And from those inferences, basically be able to kind of share that metadata and effectively sharing the details of an environment, as an example. One company I talked to recently, love to partner with them. What they're doing is phased array antennas, primarily doing it for military applications, but there's massive commercial applications specifically I'll put it this way, the capabilities of these phased array devices allow for the tracking of something, down to the millimeter level of being able to track the movement of a device. Like if you drop a coin on the floor out of someone's pocket with 3 iPhones around, just in the room, just being able to pick up that electromagnetic signal, we'll be able to say, well, that a dime fell out of someone's pocket and fell in this spot, and be able to map that over in 3D environment. So the idea there is that can be synthesized into very complex data. So I really think if any company can absolutely secure as closely as possible to the source, the data, that's a really, really big one. And being able to process that as locally as possible, that's an incredibly important thing. And I think that not many do that well, I guess I'd say, that I know of. I'm not an expert in that space, but just my general understanding, I don't think anyone does that really well, to my knowledge.
So there was a discussion I was having, again, at the trade show that I just come back from, and I'm trying to find a way to phrase the question without it making it sound like it's a loaded question, without my opinion coming into this. But there was a debate about privacy, AI, ethical technology design, and someone was very much saying that this should be a line item in an invoice. So you have the systems that you deploy, and then if your client wants it to be ethically designed or added privacy, you charge for that. My question would be, is that itself unethical? And should that not be, I guess, ingrained from the very beginning of a system design? Should not everyone have the concept of ethical technology design? So again, it's very clear, obviously, what I think on this, but I'm wondering from your perspective, how would you suggest integrators navigate that?
It's a tough one because people's livelihoods are at stake here. And the question is, what do the margins look like in general and in a very competitive environment, particularly when we're dealing with global manufacturers where they can undercut anyone, as an example? That makes it really, really challenging. Ethics, that comes at a cost of ethics, I think, to a large degree. The idea of something that can be reduced to such a price where it's impossible to do and provide a real solution, and then also thrive as a business, therefore basically making it impossible to actually do. So from that perspective, I can see the argument that says, maybe some level, maybe there are tiers effectively that say, there's a base level of privacy that just is fundamentally true. And I'm not exactly sure where that line is drawn, but I think that that's an important piece. That's one area, one way to look at it. What my heart tells me and how I've approached everything that we're doing with Kynismos and how we see all this is essentially that, is to say, look, you have to build the highest level of security and privacy into every single thing that you do. But then the services that you layer over the top of that, in our case, like how many models, how many tokens, that kind of stuff, we can then basically have a value add that goes along with that. So maybe the value add has to happen somewhere else. And in my answer, I'm kind of coming right around to where maybe where you started, which is to say that probably it is unethical on some level to do that. And the right way, I think, to do that is to make it the highest level of privacy and security as possible, and then find other things to charge for. I think maybe that gets flipped on its ear. Do that very, very well, do that extremely well for everybody, and then layer services over the top of that you can then charge for.
Okay, so let's look to the future then. Obviously, we've been talking a little bit about how we can have essentially a healthy relationship with AI and privacy. So if we fast forward 10 years, what would you like to see? What would you think is that healthy relationship? What is successful in your mind of how we actually implement AI and use it as that tool?
So I think from my perspective, it is first and foremost at the lowest possible level in this hardware, in the tech stack, at the root level, incorporate true privacy so that there is no ability for any device outside of the device that you're using and any service, even within that device, to be able to pull that information unless it's explicitly granted. And explicitly granted through rules, of course, but explicitly granted. Having said that, I think that's one piece. At a deep root level, have privacy embedded into the core of every single thing that we do. Any electronic device, anything any connected device, any Internet of Thing device should have that core of privacy built into it. That's one piece. I think that the other side of it is to allow for the users and or the integrator, the commercial interest in that situation, to monetize not the data itself, but the access to that network, I guess I'd say. So some level of ability to kind of go back into that network, because if so much processing is happening locally, it'd be really nice to be able to use that processing capability because it won't be used to maximum level generally. So that would be an interesting thing as well, to create this mesh effectively that can basically share compute effectively. I think that's another area where you can save money and actually add value in that process as well. So things like that, I think as you look at the future, I think the connectivity should be stripped of the who, and certainly the processing and everything else should be shared. That's probably a good thing, I think.
Okay, we've obviously spoken a fair bit about the inherent risks of AI, especially in relation to privacy. But I'm wondering, is there a way potentially for someone to use AI to enhance privacy, to get greater privacy? And if not, is that something that is conceivably possible in the future?
I think absolutely it is. I think that, in fact, part of the solution, so in the cybersecurity world, the kind of general consensus is that you can't use AI to defend against AI. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think on a secondary basis, you can. I think, for example, what we're doing is essentially doing that. We're processing information locally using a large language model, and then, parsing that information, putting it through multiple layers of inquiry, and then it goes out after it goes through all its privacy components, meaning the security layers. So that's an example where we're using AI to protect against AI. Another example would be when we're talking about any kind of visual, any kind of computer vision. There's no reason why, if we can tokenize that information, that tokenization essentially of everything, whether it's the color of someone's shirt to the morphology of their face or any biometric, that could be distilled down into an anonymized object, and that object can basically be then using AI synthesized and then conveyed in a way that's as lean, as streamlined as possible. So that's another way where AI can enhance that security. So a camera won't actually see you, and across the electromagnetic spectrum as a whole, it doesn't have to be able to see you specifically if we can build that into the hardware. So I think those are areas, certainly.
Do you think that's close, or is that a little bit away?
I think we're way away from that, to be honest. I don't think there's a movement in that direction at this point, not in a substantial way. It's a fringe concept, I think, honestly.
Okay, so then let's talk a little bit about Kynismos. How do integrators actually get involved? Is there, I guess, an opportunity for them to work with you to deploy your system into homes and businesses around the world? I mean, how do they work with you?
So we just launched that first version of the product, very basic. We are developing the API right now. We're not far from actually having a complete API. So we would love to begin to have those conversations now. We would tailor the API to make sure we want to speak with everyone we possibly can as early as possible. At this point, it's in that formative stage of developing the kind of the access to the root of the code. So the more conversations we have now, the better off we are. We can very quickly adapt to a particular platform and to a particular system as a whole, and to integrators as well, to provide those tools. So ideally, there's no better time than now to start having those conversations. So we're actively looking for those. Any integrator, any manufacturer, hardware, software system across the entire spectrum that can use a privacy component, particularly when working with large language models, but then as we extend into other areas as well. Be grateful for any conversations we would have. They would be learning experiences for us. We would also be able to build a very integrated system with any company. And we have really a state-of-the-art level of what Signal does for human-to-human communication, we do for human-to-machine communication.
A huge thanks to Andrew Sispoidis for a truly thought-provoking conversation. It's easy to get swept up in the potential of AI. Automation, prediction, personalization. But conversations like this remind us that technology isn't neutral. The choices we make today about what we install, how we configure it, and what we explain to our clients will shape the experiences people have in their homes for years to come. So, as integrators, we have a role to play, not just as enablers of convenience, but as stewards of trust, of privacy, and of boundaries. If this episode raised questions for you, or challenged how you think about the systems you're delivering, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me a line at info@masterintegrator.com.au or connect with me on LinkedIn. And thanks again to Chords and Connected Magazine for their ongoing support. It is truly appreciated. These companies are supporting what we do as an industry, so make sure you check them out. It's important to support the companies that support us. Thanks for listening to Master Integrator. I'm Paul Skelton. I'll see you next time.